Welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Today we're joined by Dr. Eric Monday. Eric is the Executive Vice President at the University of Kentucky, and he shares his insights onto the roles of University of Kentucky's brand in the community and the evolving landscape of college athletics. We discuss revenue challenges, private equity, infrastructure investments, and the future of student-athlete opportunities on his campus. Dr. Monday also discusses Kentucky's strategies in growing revenue, as well as driving greater engagement from his leadership to strengthen their position in athletics. I hope you'll enjoy the conversation. Hi, Eric. It's great to see you again. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Karen. Yeah, good to see you as well.
Absolutely. So you are coming to me from the legendary Rupp Arena, where Kentucky basketball had a good first start of the season. Talk about the role Kentucky basketball plays on your campus.
Yeah, I'm excited to come to you, Karen, from Rupp Arena, that infamous facility here in downtown Lexington. We had a nice opening win a couple nights ago. It was a great start. I mean, when you think about the brand, right? So we think about athletics as a front porch in many ways. I think when you think about the brand UK basketball and Kentucky basketball, it's not just important to the university, but it's important to the whole Commonwealth. And so in some ways, I think we talk about Kentucky and people talk about basketball, bourbon now, I think, and horses. And so it's kind of one of those three. So for the institution, all of our sports are important. And when you think about what we've been able to do institutionally of ensuring we have great equity and equality across all the sports, facilities, recruitment, budgets, and so on. But that basketball is one that I think is more well known in many ways than any of our other sports. Clearly, we've had the most success as it relates to championships, but it's meaningful. It's meaningful to the people, it's meaningful to the community, and it's meaningful across all the 4.5 million people.
And plus, you're a member of the SEC, so talk a little bit about what that means to the campus.
It just means more. That's the first thing that comes to mind. I got to serve on that group a few years ago, Karen, that came up with that. And, it's how many games do we go to, right? How many conference events do we go to where they're naming and they're talking about the conference, right? I mean, SEC, that chant, the commissioner and the leadership strategy that's been so strong of that conference for decades now. And we go back even beyond Greg and all the great things of the conference, what it provides as it relates to an opportunity financially for an athletics department. And so I'm always a big believer. I've had the opportunity to work in like brand management for a few decades across institutions. And, you brand with equal or better. Right. And so that SEC brand is so strong, and you bring a Kentucky and obviously the expansion and some of the traditional members of that conference. I just think better together is the term it comes to mind, but it provides opportunities, it opens doors, it provides guidance and support. We are so proud to be a member of that conference.
Yeah, it's a tremendous conference. Of course, it's considered like the big two in the midst of all this upheaval. But one of the ways you and I met was on a private equity panel about a month ago in Denver. And so obviously schools like Kentucky and other schools are looking for ways to grow their bottom line, to grow their revenues. So you've been very active in this space. Talk a little bit about what you think about this emerging possibility for revenue in college sports.
I do think we have to look at all options, right? And so we have an obligation to understand all. I'm still, I think we're a little challenged on where private equity fits today, but with the additional expenses that we all are going to have in college athletics and the revenue share, of course, we think about NIL, we think about just traditional inflation that we have, additional scholarships. No harm or foul here, just the facts of the environment we're in. Where are we going to able to generate that additional revenue. Are we going to be able to cut that much out of the expense side? No way, right? We're going to have to do both, I do believe. But what is the role today or in the future? I do think we always need to keep our eye on what the pro market's doing. I think that's an important to have that as a indicator. How does that suggest to us what that may, and we know what some of the pro markets have done to open some limited investment of private equity into that. I think, to me, when you think about private equity and control, the return that's necessary, the amount of exit strategy that most private equity investments want. So how does that fit in a college athletics program? I think we are still seeing some real challenges of how those fit together, and how we do partnerships all the time, right? We are very, very happy with our media rights partner. We're happy with the partners we have on our healthcare side of our business and so on. But when you have those partnerships, you got to have that equal yoke of what we call program and principles. And how do we have an alignment of interest and values and program and principles? And so how do we achieve that with a private equity market? I think most of us still see that as a real difficult thing, Karen.
Yeah, I think some of the points you brought up are important, but let's define what kind of money would be coming into this space in private equity, and also what the investors get out of it. How does that work?
Sure. And what's also, Karen, I think it's a great point of zoom out for a second, is we may have not called it private equity, but there's been private monies that are coming into universities and athletics departments, as you well know, whether it's your institution or my institution or others, for various things. Just think about philanthropy. And so that's a gift that maybe there's not a return, there's not an exit, maybe it's a name, but that's an outside dollar. If we think about media rights, if we think about shoe contracts, if we think about, those are dollars, right? Sponsorships that are coming in. I think when you're thinking about private equity, if they want to come into invest in something that's going to yield a lot more revenue, is an accelerant. To me, is there a way where a private equity investment can accelerate something that an institution either cannot do or would be slower in doing on its own? So the first thing that I think comes to mind is infrastructure. So are there infrastructure opportunities to build a new venue, to create new seating strategies, you're generating 10 million a year in seat revenue. Can we generate 20 million if we have more premium environments? What are the pros doing that most colleges are not yet doing? I think about the venue and the management of the venue. So many institutions build venues based on what a coach wants, maybe more than what a fan needs and wants. And so I do think there's going to be an evolution to more of that pro model, where they're building it to maximize fan experience, fan satisfaction, and the players to some extent. In our case, let's call it our student athletes rather than players. But there's a little bit different prioritization. So it goes back to that earlier comment. How are we looking to the pros a little bit more? So infrastructure, I think that may be an opportunity, because you could generate more revenue. We could share that. The other one, Karen, is, are there institutions that are going to need that equity investment with a significant return? I think about equity investments, a double-digit return is what they are traditionally going to want. They may have a loss leader, may start small, but traditionally we're talking about, in my mind, 12, 14, 16, 18%. We're thinking about an exit in 5, 10, 15, and we want to have some control, right? We're not going to, one of the things I teach at the university is personal finance and financial planning, and we talk about the most important four-letter word is risk. And so how does that private equity investor manage their risk? They're going to want some influence on the cost side, or some influence on how that new venue is sold, to ensure they can get to that return. How do we have joint interest on those things? So an accelerant that is clearly defined and has a business case that's supportable, that maybe that is an interest. Maybe changing to a new conference could be an interest, but I think most of us are still struggling.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people talk about infrastructure as being the first logical place. You hear a lot about innovation districts, entertainment districts. One of the questions I've always had around that is, How does that work in a nonprofit or not-for-profit environment? Can you explain that?
Sure, and I think one of the things we've learned from what other institutions have done, and I think about the great work that Ohio State has done on some of these things, of where they looked at even their parking, and they look to monetize something, and then what that dollar is used for, I think is such a critical conversation. So at that point, that president, that leader of the Ohio State University said, we're going to use that new dollar when we thought about selling our transportation or our parking environment, and we were going to invest it in new faculty lines, right? We were going to invest it in the academic enterprise. So I do think that is a characteristic. So are we going to have a transparent conversation where we're going to say as institutions, we're going to have to do X, Y, and Z because we have to figure out a way to generate an additional 40 or $50 million. Is it more difficult in the nonprofit? One of the things we always talk about is land, brand, and demand. And so if we have land, most institutions have tremendous land and land banks. They have this built-in demand and they have strong brands. And so to your earlier point, private equity, I think, can have a negative connotation. Let's maybe start talking about this as outside investment.
Okay.
Because in some ways, we built our baseball stadium, Kentucky Proud Park, with a significant investment from our multimedia rights partner. In fact, 30 million of roughly a $50 million facility was an outside dollar from our media rights partner.
Wow.
Now, there's no payback on that, but they invested that because they thought they were going to grow, and they have more media rights revenue. So I think maybe some of this is the words we're using. And maybe in some ways, if we start adjusting those words differently, will that adjust the interest in this dynamic of outside investment rather than private equity investment? I'm wondering if there's not a new market that's created between a private equity 15-point return and a public institution issuing their own debt at 4% in the middle. And how does that, the market's going to win, don't we think, Karen, in the end?
Always. That's interesting because in our conference discussion, panel discussion, we talked about that difference between private credit, private equity, the return on investment, but also the internal interest rates that schools could get. So how would you advise presidents to think about that whole part of this?
Yeah, so it is all about understanding so one, we got to have an honest conversation.
Yeah.
What is the need? How we're going to solve that? I'm a big believer in multiple solutions. Don't just bring me one, right? Give me 3 or 4 choices and the pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses. So one, we got to do an honest evaluation of what are we trying to achieve? I love Stephen Covey, right? Principle 2, what's the end in mind? I mean, what's the problem? What are we trying to achieve, and how do we get there? And so bring multiple solutions. And then if it's going to be, let's just use this example, Karen, 4% internal money, 8% private credit, and let's call 12 to 15 private equity. And so what's the differential that we're going to be able to achieve before 8, or in this case, 12 as an example? And if we're going to pay double or triple for the money, what are we getting in return? Is it time? Is it expertise? Is it understanding of the market at a different level? Higher education institutions, we're in the business primarily of one thing, right? Educating students, helping them to go out and have a life of meaning and purpose and cross that stage. 2, some of us are in the business of building amazing healthcare organizations that's improving the health of a commonwealth or of their state. And then when we think about these fan experiences, these alumni experiences, this connection, this front porch concept, let's call athletics and that opportunity to be 3. And how does that fit? I do think there is going to be a huge shift towards more institutional investment in athletics departments. I think that is going to be one of the first steps.
Yeah, I saw that. I was reading the other day that one institution was saying they've got to find $30 to $40 million by next year in order to be able to do what they need to do. Those are monumental leaps for some schools. Heck, $3 to $4 million could be a huge leap. How would you advise presidents to assess the landscape now, knowing that they just won't have the as you said, the brand and land. And what was the third thing you said? Brand, land, and demand
Demand.
may not be the same for their institutions as it is for your institution.
I think you're exactly right. How I think about this, Karen, is you're looking 20-25% change. So
Yeah.
let's say an average athletic department and even a big conference is 150, 200, 250. If you got to go find 30, 40, 50 million, just think about your personal budget. If one of us had to go find 25%, cut expenses, build revenue, I mean, that's nearly impossible to
Yeah.
do. And we don't have a year, right? I mean, it's November. We
Exactly.
got, right? We got like
Exactly.
7 months. And we in our college athletics departments are going to be writing letters of intent and signing those with student athletes in the next 30 days. And
Yes.
so what is in those letters and what are we committing to? I like four things. We talked a little bit about this in our session you mentioned earlier. One is we got to recognize and have some acknowledgement. Are we all acknowledging the issue and the problem? Do we have a full understanding? Are presidents and athletics directors and CFOs at those institutions having those conversations? And is there an acknowledgement? What is the challenge that we're trying to face? Is it 40 million, 45 million, 35? What's the number? Number two is I think institutions on the higher ed side of our business and the athletic side of our business, we are not usually very good at controlling the expense side.
Hmm.
We like to build the revenue side, grow enrollment, adjust ticket
Absolutely.
pricing. The expense side's hard. You have to look at the expense side here. Whether you go to zero-based budgeting, whether we go and say, look, we have X million and this is what we're going to do and we're going to stop and adjust. That's two. Number three is we got to consider new growth. We really have to think about how we're going to grow and think about our facilities. And then the last one is we have to build multiple scenarios,
Hmm.
right? This cannot be a scenario one. We have to have, I think, a big table. This is not something that we're going to achieve in a small table environment. I think about Ed Bastian and what he said at Delta Airlines during COVID. It's easy when you get in a tough spot to skinny the room down because it's safer. This is where I think we need more minds and more thinking and more strategies, and we need a bigger table at our university. So I would encourage presidents to think about who's their best thinkers, right? Maybe it's their vice president of research. It's not just in your domain. We got to think broader than that. And this cannot just be a president and an athletic director, right? You're going to have more faculty. What's the role of
Yes.
faculty, Karen, in
I
these
could not agree more.
conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. We've had too few people at the table. And I wonder if what you said earlier was about athletics being the front porch, the branding mechanism. I'm wondering if we're looking at that idea or concept correctly anymore, because it might not be possible to do the broad based programs or even the sport selection of programs, i.e., football is an expensive sport, rowing, expensive sport. Do we try to scale down our aspirations or even who we try to consider as our peer institutions to try to manage this new world?
I think immediately, Karen, and we haven't talked about it much, you're starting to see more articles about it,
Yeah.
but there will be fewer college student athletes in America a year from now at Division One. I don't know how that's not going to be the case, right? A football program, if you're a football program, you're going to go from most of them are at least 120 to 105, right? The new roster limit. So that's 15 students, and you do that times 100 or however many programs we have out there now. And so so how does that then, and are we going to have institutions? No one's having these, I think, broadly yet, but are we going to be able to fund 16, 18, 20, 25, some institutions in the 30s number of sports?
Yeah.
And if we are going to be able to fund it, is it a different discussion and environment? So all of us, most of us have had kids that play sports now. There's great podcasts out there talking about Little League and what people spend on that and so on. I mean, you're having people spend, and I'm me included, 15,000, 20, 25,000 a year for your child to play Little League or hockey or to play, baseball in high school and travel teams and all that. Is that going to transition to college? Are we going to have a different category, intramurals, collegiate, intercollegiate? Is there going to be a new category in between, kind of the club sports, but asterisk, where there's going to be more commitment from families and individuals to still play? And how does that going to fit into, let's say, an NCAA or non-NCAA system? I mean, the market, as we said, will win. Where that goes and how quickly, I think initially we are going to unfortunately have fewer experiences for students in the colleges and universities. And whether the front porch concept, and you know this from where you are. I mean, the front porch being only athletics is probably a little cliche, right? The front porch is so many other things. I mean, if you have a health system, the front porch may be health system even more than athletics. You may be touching more people than you are in athletics. That's not a zero sum. We can all rise the boat together here. But I think there's a lot of front porch opportunities. That's not to suggest that we should not invest in college athletics. What I'm saying, though, is I think there's going to have to be more detailed and transparent conversations. Maybe it's the term return. What is the return on these level investments? If I'm a faculty member, and we're going to, you only spend $1 once, right? Karen, I always tell the provost that, right? You only spend the dollar one time. Love our provost. But, when you put that $1 in, you can't spend it on something else. And so if I'm a faculty member and we're going to take a couple $1,000,000 of institutional resources and move that to athletics, that's a couple $1,000,000 we're not putting into faculty salaries, faculty labs, new faculty hires. So how do we think about it? Is that going to be a tension that we haven't really faced at some institutions traditionally? What about student fees? Are we going to go back to student fee environments?
Those are all really important questions. I think about that a lot because I feel like in this day where you read in the Chronicle or Inside Higher Ed about schools that are cutting positions, cutting programs, but I don't read about what changes they're making in athletics. I suspect that they're just, stringing them along, trying to get by with the next bus trip, with the next championship game, that type of thing. I don't think there's a plan. And I think the one piece of advice I'd like you to offer is how do schools think about planning if they don't have the resources of Kentucky or Ohio State? But they want to make athletics an important part of the experience, but yet they're faced with those parents that have invested $15,000 a year in their youth sports, and they're expecting a great experience in facilities and coaching and everything else. It's a big question.
Yeah, and one is, what are our principles? So, before we make the decisions, what are the principles? So we've heard from some university presidents who said it is our goal to continue to have the same number of experiences for our students that we have today. Okay. And so, no harm or foul, but what are we trying to do? What are we trying to achieve? What are our principles? So in the case of, let's say, an institution that's in the Southern United States in a football state, right? Their principle may be that football generates 75% of the revenue, and football is critical for our ability to build the environment that we want. And we're willing to invest more into the football program at that institution. So, I mean, that could be one of the things that they're trying to do. So I think we have to start with those principles and understand the principles and have big table conversations on that, and then start working the plan. I think sometimes we start implementing a plan and before we understand what are the principles and we're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. I agree on that 100%. Talk to me a little bit about your board. Is it a board of trustees at Kentucky? Is that what it's called? How you interface bringing them up to speed in this new environment?
Yeah, so our board, we have a 20-person board at the University of Kentucky, and you see it in higher education, as you know, Karen, especially at public institutions, probably somewhere between 10 and 30 is traditional. Sometimes
Mhm.
private
Yeah.
institutions are larger. So fairly similar if I looked at other SEC schools. The other one I worked at for 16 years, LSU, had 16 members, so similar. We have an athletics committee and with a chair and 4 other members who are members, and then some community members as well, which is a nice touch at UK to have 3 community members. And so our responsibility is to keep the chair of that board as well as the executive committee of the entire board informed on a regular basis.
Okay.
So that's the president, the athletics director, my position, and a few others, regularly keeping them engaged and informed. But Karen, I think you're hitting on a really important point. I think the engagement and involvement of boards, specifically athletic committees in these conversations, is going to increase. I think it varies in institution, right? Some institutions, they get involved in coaching searches, right? When those come
Yes.
up, and they get involved in, some other issues related to athletics, ticket allocation, things of that nature. I think what you're going to start to see is a more in-depth interest, engagement, involvement in how revenues are allocated, other types of things. So I'm really interested to see how that evolves.
That's such an important topic. One of the things that I saw from AGB a few years ago was that only 25% of the boards in the country had an athletics committee. And it strikes me as a missed opportunity. What do you think?
I'm surprised by that, Karen. I didn't know
Yeah,
that's a number I wasn't familiar with.
yeah,
Yeah, no, I think you're onto something there. I think when you're thinking about reputation, and so, when I zoom out and I think about reputation, I think the athletics department reputational impact on an institution is extreme. And I think about, the tail wagging the dog of finances. So at the University of Kentucky, athletics is 200 million of an $8.4 billion budget. It's small related to 3%, if you will, as it relates to the budget. But I would think reputationally, we opened this conversation, Karen, talking about Kentucky basketball, right? If Kentucky basketball is not going to be in the discussion of the NCAA tournament or the discussion of a Final Four for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, what does that do to the board, the president, the athletic director, the the basketball coach, even beyond that? It would impact the football coach as well, right? It would impact all coaches.
sure.
And so I think board engagement and involvement on this matter, and I think your point's a valid one. That's probably something that AGB should encourage even more as we think about board makeup. It is a reputational risk. It is going to be a greater financial risk than it is today, and it's been challenged before. And so engagement, involvement, we always talk about, our president talks about that we want to engage, inform, and inspire the board, right? That is our responsibility and strategy, and that's what we attempt to do.
My sense in this conversation, Eric, is that you guys are pretty laser focused on the future. Would you agree with that?
Um, I think we are doing a good job, and we're very blessed at the University of Kentucky with an amazing AD in Mitch Barnhart, who served over 2 decades as the athletic director of the University of Kentucky. So I think what he has built in his downline, which you know well, of other ADs that are out there, which I think is always an evidence of a good athletic director or administrator. But we have our challenges as well, right? This is a new day, and I think it's important to understand this is the next step, right? Do we think this is the final step? I think it's kind of an iteration.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
how do we prepare for the next 3, 5, 7, 10? And then how do we think about what may come after that? We got a lot of work to do. I do think we have a great team here, and we're having good conversations, but we have not figured it out, Karen. We have a lot of work to
Sure.
do too.
Final question. What keeps you up at night?
Well, nothing related to my job, Karen. I think you and I have had this conversation before.
Yes,
If I
yes.
have a job that keeps me up at night, then I'm
Yeah,
finding another job.
right, right,
But
right, right.
what I do, I am concerned. I think we are concerned about the opportunities for student athletes,
Yeah,
and I do think that short term we're going to have fewer. And I shared with you, Karen, I think on our session, that many of us have dreams that this is going to come down a little bit, and then we're going to figure out a way for it to come back up to where I know from personal experience that a athletic experience informs, educates, shapes creates this amazing student, young person that can change the world. And I can name the names of people I know, and provides opportunities in certain sports for students that would never be able to go to college. And so, our responsibility is to improve access, right? And to have the best outcomes. And so this is going to challenge access for so many
Yeah.
people. And so how do we figure out a way to where even if we're going to dip, that we can come back in the future? That's our dream.
I love it. I love it. Eric, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate you taking time with my listeners, my students, to talk about this from your position.
Thanks, Karen. It's always a pleasure. I appreciate the time and look forward to continuing conversation.